Illinois Democrats tell Governor Gregg Abbott to keep Chicago's name out of his mouth. In the wake of a deadly school shooting in his state, Texas Governor Gregg Abbott is pointing his finger at Chicago to argue the case for why he opposes stricter gun laws. At a May 25th press conference, the governor said, "I hate to say this, there are more people that are shot every weekend in Chicago than there are in schools in Texas." Abbott said, "So if you're looking for a real solution, Chicago teaches that what you are talking about is not a real solution." But Illinois Democrats, including the state's governor in Chicago, Maine, Lori Lightfoot, are clapping back and telling Abbott to stay in his lane. In a tweet, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker wrote, "You are lying about Chicago and what actually perpetuates gun violence. The majority of guns used in Chicago shootings come from states with lax gun laws. Do better. You have 19 kids and 2 teachers who deserve our best." See, and now it is on Twitter right there. Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot also chimed in to stand up for her city, tweeting, "I work day and night to stop the violence. I see the suffering. Open your eyes," Lightfoot wrote. "Lives are being lost. Be part of the solution and get the hell out of the way." And Chicago Alderman Gilbert Villegas took it even further, calling Abbott an a-hole. And there's his post right there in Twitter. You can read it in the link I'm going to put. In Tuesday's shooting, the gunman used an AR-15 style semi-automatic rifle to murder 19 children and 2 teachers at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. Authorities say he legally purchased 2 assault rifles just after his 18th birthday. Democrats and Republicans have long been at odds about the best way to deal with the issue of gun violence in the country. Most Democrats, including President Biden, are pushing for stricter regulations, including background checks and so forth. Let me just say this. They did a study years ago, and they found that much of the guns used in crimes in Chicago came from one particular gun store right across the state in Indiana. Yep. I don't have the link. Maybe if I can find it, I could put it up, but they're absolutely right. Governor Abbott, he's making it look like, okay, you have all these strict gun laws and you still have a lot of crime. So obviously your strict gun laws are not working. Well, you could say the same thing about immigration, right? We have a lot of immigration laws, and you still have a lot of illegals coming into the country. It's not that we don't have laws. It's there are ways people get around and find ways to get into the country. So it's like saying, oh yeah, well, maybe we shouldn't have any immigration laws then, because you have all these strict immigration laws and people still find their way into the country. All right. See? So what are you supposed to do? Do away with the laws? Well, states like Indiana, they have lax gun laws. Even Texas. This guy was able to buy a gun as soon as after his 18th birthday. He bought 2 guns. I think in a matter of 3 days. That should have been a signal right there. Those type of guns have no place in a civilized society. I mean, really, why do you need such guns? You see? And they keep talking about the Second Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Second Amendment. When was the Second Amendment written? Right? That was back in the 18th century. It was written, the Second Amendment. And the guns they were using back then were very different. I think you can shoot like one at a time. They had like musket. They never envisioned the kind of guns you have now. Even when I was a teenager, I remember the police here in New York City. They used to use the 38 caliber. It was like 6 shots. Those are the guns the police were using back then. That was like the 1970s or so forth. They didn't even have these kind of semi-automatics we see now that are more popular. These guns that can really do a hell of a job when you start shooting. Of course, they always had machine guns around, but then machine guns, if you go back in time, they were legal at one time. If you think of like the 1920s, with the crimes, with the mafia and so forth in Chicago. Yeah, I think they call it the Valentine Day Massacre, when they shot a whole bunch of people in no time. So then the machine guns were not allowed. Only like the dealers supposedly can have machine guns, but the average person couldn't own a machine gun. But they have semi-automatic. But now they sell these gadgets that you can kind of get around that. So the guy who did that shooting in Las Vegas at that hotel some years ago, when he killed so many people, shooting from his hotel window, he used one of those gadgets that you can turn your gun into like an automatic and just shoot without having to, be full. So back then, when they added this, that right, the Second Amendment, that technology wasn't around. It wasn't around at all. That's like think of the airplane, for example. Back then in those days, nobody had any concept somebody could be flying through the skies in a vehicle. Wow. They had none, and there's nothing in the Constitution written that says you have that right to fly around in what's now called an airplane, right? Nothing. But technology improves, you see. People are able to invent things and so forth. No telephone in those days. No trains in those days, Go back to the 1800s, there were no trains or anything like that. Used like horses to get around. You want to go from New York to Philadelphia, you got to use a horse, a wagon to travel. That's the way it was. So when people talk about the Second Amendment, the people who wrote the Second Amendment back then, they had no concept of these kind of guns. And in the Second Amendment, they mention a well-regulated militia. And if you ask anybody, nobody ever wants to talk about a well-regulated militia. You see? Because it doesn't include them. Because they're not part of one. Anything that's well-regulated, when you think of something that's well-regulated, that means you're following orders, you're stepping in conformity with something that's going on. And how many of these people who who want to buy guns and just go shoot out there? Want to belong to anything where you have order that's well regulated. So whatever happened to those was a well-regulated militia. People just don't want to talk about it. A well-regulated militia. See, even the Supreme Court went to change their laws allowing for guns. I think there's a case called Heller, Washington, I believe, D.C., and they allow, this guy can have a gun because he was scared or what have you. Even in that case, but still, it was limited to inside the house, not outside. Now, there's a case before the court about in New York being able to carry a gun, but it's not so much carry a gun on you, but carry a gun like you want to go to a range, because in New York, you're supposed to have, if you're carrying a gun to the range, it's supposed to be locked, like in the trunk of the vehicle, and it's not supposed to be loaded. And New York City was stupid enough to come up with some law, because when I was younger, I used to have a permit where I used to do practice. And in those days, I used to go to New Jersey, even though I live in New York. See? And New York came up with this law that said, well, you not only, I think what New York was trying to do, which kind of backfired, they were trying to make it more difficult to own a gun legally. So when I had mine back then, they didn't care what range I went to. I used to go to New Jersey, and looking back, I don't think you're supposed to take your gun out of the state, but that's where we used to go, to New Jersey. I believe it was Hoboken. So then New York City got this idea. Let's make it that you can only go to a range, like within the state of New York. Okay, but you have to register and belong to a range. Well, what does that do? That makes things more expensive, because now you gotta belong to a range. The range in New York, especially in New York City, gonna cost a lot of money to be a member, and they know you have no choice, so more than likely they're gonna gouge you. Right? So that's what it is. So someone I know, he was in a dilemma because he had his permit and he had to belong to a range. And I said, well, look, I went online, I checked, and you can, there's like a gun range in Binghamton, New York. Real cheap. And I told him, look, check this out. And he said, you think that's going to work? And I said, yeah, sure it's going to work. It's within the same state of New York. See? And it's way cheaper. I think it was something like $25 something, You just pay that fee and you can go shoot there. Of course, he never went to shoot there. Binghamton is far from New York City. But the whole point was that I gave him a loophole where he can get out of it and he can go, he can still own the gun without having to, pay some exorbitant fee within New York City. Then New York City, if that wasn't enough, they decided, okay, now you can't take the gun out of the city. You can't travel with it. So if you want to go to Binghamton, for example, or some other parts of the state where it's much cheaper to go to a gun range, you can't do that. So New York City screwed itself, and then they got sued. And then they went all the way to the Supreme Court. And it looks like the Supreme Court is going to rule and say, well, wait a minute. This person has a Second Amendment right, and they should be able to carry a gun. Now, carry their gun in what capacity, I'm not sure how they're going to rule. But even New York City is saying that chances are they're going to rule against New York City. So what New York City did was that they decided to repeal that law, which they did, and say, well, wait a minute now, no, you don't have to be forced to shoot within New York City. You can carry a gun out of state, you don't have to worry about that. And they repealed it, but that wasn't good enough for the court. The court still decided to hear the case anyway. That's the Supreme Court. They decided, well, we're going to hear this case anyway, whether New York wants to or not. So that's the scary part that scared the city of New York, because the Supreme Court is saying, okay, now normally, if there's a law and it's repealed, then it becomes moot. And if it becomes moot, then the court is going to say, well, there's no sense we hearing this case because this law doesn't exist anymore. It's moot. However, the conservatives in the court, the Supreme Court in Washington, they decided no, the law may be moot, it may be repealed, but we're still going to hear the case anyway. So that's why New York City is so sure that they're going to overturn this law. And that law has been around for like over 100 years, about not being able to carry a gun like that. You got to show really good reason why you can walk around with a gun on you. So that law been around a very, very long time, from what I understand. It's not something like, it's not like some liberal or what have you decided to come up with that law. That was a long way back in the old days when you had like Republicans and as governors and controlling the legislature. It was around a long, long time. So for those people who might think, well, it's all New York liberal. No, that's not how it was. It's been around for the longest. But New York City, unfortunately, pushed the limits, see? And now it finds itself in trouble. So that's the story behind that.